I'm Patrick Watson, I'm an astrologer, and you're watching 12 different types of Aries Rising, the fourth part. We're looking at Aries Rising with Mars in Gemini, the third house. So let's take a look at what the third house means. The third house is typically supposed to be about siblings, your neighborhood, your family, friends, places that are in proximity to your home, which makes sense because the fourth house is associated with like your home and your parents and your origins more broadly. So the third is next to your home and your parents and your origins, but not quite. It's extended out from it, and we can see this in the zodiacal and diurnal motion of the third house because planets which are in the third move down and toward one's origins in terms of zodiacal motion going through the zodiac, but diurnal motion, the turn of the Earth's turn, is basically pulling planets away from the fourth. It's deflecting them. It's flicking planets off from the fourth and out towards the third to unknown destinations, but in proximity to one's home. So this kind of gives us the idea of like why it would be about siblings and neighborhoods and things like that, because it's in the neighborhood of your home, but not your home itself. Now there's a very mercurial sensibility about the third house generally, and there's kind of a restlessness about planets in the third. Since it's opposed to the ninth of like more orthodox religion, the third kind of has a more dissenting or dissident, unorthodox or contra-orthodox kind of flavor or something. It's a more restless place, and when planets from the third, they're more curious and they're more explorative, and they're more this sort of it's kind of a house of quickness and quickening. It's a restless kind of place, going from place to place. And we'll kind of see this kind of restlessness and this sort of curiosity and contrariety and mobility themes pop up in our real world examples. So how does this apply specifically to Aries Rising? So, Aries Rising with Mars in Gemini in the third house, I like to call this the Roughrider, the teammate, the hot rod. So this is someone who's characterized by forceful interactions with peers and teams, operating with speed and fluidity, competitive, playfully aggressive, uncensored, contrarian, and multivalent. One thing I forgot to mention about the third is that the third house, because it's not just your siblings or your close friends in terms of I guess what I'm trying to say is the third is also about like bands and ensembles, collaborations. That's a way that it can manifest in terms of like one's brother. Sometimes it's not like your literal sibling, but the sort of people that you kind of collaborate with. So we'll see a little bit of that as we go on. So David Spade was born with Aries Rising with Mars and Gemini in the third. And so what's interesting about that is that he's known for his kind of searing snarkiness and his sarcasm and his brutal put-downs. His ability to roast people is pretty good. And we can sort of see this because it's in a close sextile with Mercury, the jokester. But, in general, we can see that this is supposed to show that the topic of siblings and friends is this like major focus in his life. And so sometimes this can mean bringing distinction to yourself through a band or a group or ensemble. I think that's what I was trying to say before. So when we think about David Spade, we may probably remember him most for, his famous collaborations with Chris Farley, who in a sense was like his brother. In these buddy comedies like Tommy Boy and Black Sheep. And he also came to prominence, through his work in comedy ensembles like Saturday Night Live. And another interesting thing is that the third house is associated with short trips and motion and mobility. And David Spade is a major car collector, and he spends millions of dollars in old school muscle cars. And he's not like a racer like Juan Manuel Fangio, and he's not a manufacturer like the Ligier guy. But he likes to just sort of collect them in the third house. He likes to sort of drive them around his neighborhood. Like, he's not not a serious racer. You know what I mean? Now, what we don't really know too much about is what the relationships were like with his two brothers. He did have two brothers, and I imagine he was the youngest of them, so I think he had to be somewhat competitive with them, I imagine. He did recount a story in an interview about how his brother betrayed him during a fraternity hazing ritual, so maybe there's kind of a playful competition kind of between them or something. I'm not sure. We don't really know, but we do know that David Spade's life seems to have revolved around he's been able to distinguish himself best through his sibling partnerships, through his group work, through his work in ensembles or in comedic pairings. So I thought that was pretty cool. Jerome Lawrence is a playwright, and he was born with Aries Rising with Mars and Gemini third. And so something really interesting about him is he was the guy who founded Armed Forces Radio in a writing partnership that he had with Robert E. Lee, who is a playwright, not the general, during his military service in World War II. So he wrote dozens of programs and radio plays with Lee for service members. And after World War II, they continued this famous collaboration in playwriting for decades. And they focused, some of the most successful plays dealt with historical events with controversial political themes, such as the Scopes Monkey Trial or Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. And what I think is really interesting about that is he has this quote, which I think really sums up Mars and the Third pretty well. He said, he described the plays they wrote together as sharing the theme of dignity, the dignity of every individual mind, and that mind's lifelong battle against limitation and censorship. And I think that's interesting because, the third is, this more heretical or unorthodox or dissident place. And so, it's here and with Mars in the third that he kind of takes this, stand, this more sort of rebellious kind of stance, but it's specifically through the idea of like the mind and freedom of speech, and we get those kind of connotations from the fact that it's in Gemini, ruled by Mercury. And, he did this in collaboration with, his friend, Robert E. Lee. So, and then we also get the Armed Forces Radio in there. Mars is the military, and the third house in Gemini are related to the concepts of media and communication. And so I think that Mars placement for Jerome Lawrence is really evocative of the life that he ended up having. Kathleen Kennedy is a movie producer, and she's one of the most successful movie producers of all time, currently the Lucasfilm president overseeing Star Wars. And so she has a bunch of planets in the third, but we're just going to focus on Mars just for a second. So this should ideally mean that, she distinguishes herself through collaborations and partnerships, and that is sort of the case. She was originally Steven Spielberg's secretary, and she gave such good ideas in her role as a secretary on his movies that eventually he just asked her to be a producer for the movie. So I don't want people to get the impression that she only got where she was because of other people, but just that she did probably her best work by being able to be in collaboration with others. In fact, she answers this question in a really satisfactory way, I think. This journalist said, "I asked Kennedy about an observation I've heard about her from various people who make reference to a career surrounded by powerful men, Spielberg, Lucas, her own husband, and then note the novelty of her now being the one in charge. She looked ever so mildly annoyed, and then responded that she didn't entirely understand the question. I met all these guys when they were big, powerful guys," she said, setting the words big and powerful in air quotes. The great thing is, at whatever point they decided they were powerful, they always empowered me. So I never felt like I was in the midst of something that wasn't a balanced relationship. And that's a good point. George Lucas and Steven Spielberg were kind of nobodies when she met them. They weren't Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, So it was through these friends that she got that she did really good work and was able to distinguish herself further. So another interesting thing is that she does have a sister. In fact, Kathleen Kennedy has a twin sister, Connie Kennedy, and she is also a movie producer and has worked on movies for Walt Disney Studios, which is the parent company of Lucasfilm, which is the same company that Kathleen Kennedy works for. We don't know anything about their partnership or their relationship, but it's not public. But it's interesting to consider because that means they both likely would have Mars as the same ascendant ruler in the same sign. So one wonders if there was some kind of competition between them or something. But yeah, interesting example, I thought. So that concludes my section for Mars in Gemini in the third with Aries Rising. And next we'll be looking at Aries Rising with Mars in Cancer in the fourth house.